Picture this. Thousands of sheep dumped on a barren rock in the middle of nowhere. No grass, no trees, just volcanic stone and the cold Atlantic wind. The scientists walked away and didn't come back for decades. When they finally returned, the island had transformed into something nobody predicted. And the sheep? Well, they weren't exactly sheep anymore. This isn't some twisted experiment from a B-movie. This actually happened, and the results rewrote what we thought we knew about evolution, survival, and what happens when you leave nature completely unsupervised. So buckle up, because this story gets weird fast. Let's rewind to 1932. The place is St. Kilda, an archipelago sitting about 40 miles west of Scotland's Outer Hebrides. And when I say middle of nowhere, I mean it. This place makes remote look crowded. The main island, Hirta, is basically a chunk of volcanic rock that forgot to become hospitable. Cliffs that shoot straight up from the ocean. Wind that never stops. Rain that comes sideways. Zero trees. The kind of place where even the seagulls look depressed. For thousands of years, people actually lived here. Not because they wanted to, but because their ancestors did. And leaving meant crossing some of the nastiest water in the North Atlantic. The St. Kildans developed this incredibly hardcore way of life. They'd scale those massive cliffs with nothing but rope made from horsehair to hunt seabirds, puffins, gannets, fulmars. If it had wings and flew near St. Kilda, it was dinner. They also kept sheep. Specifically, a breed called Soay sheep. These things looked like they wandered out of the Stone Age. Which makes sense because they basically did. Dark brown wool, curved horns, about the size of a large dog. They're one of the most primitive breeds of domestic sheep still around. Pretty much unchanged, since the Bronze Age. The Vikings probably brought them over 1,000 years ago. Looked around, said good enough and bounced. But here's the thing about St. Kilda. Life there was brutal. The islanders were constantly one bad harvest, one rough winter, or one pandemic away from catastrophe. They were so isolated that when a boat finally did show up with supplies, half the population would get sick from germs they had zero immunity to. They called it the stranger's cough. Imagine living somewhere so remote that the common cold becomes a legitimate threat to your entire community. By the early 1900s, the population was dwindling. People were leaving. The young folks were especially over it. Why live on a rock where you risk your life climbing cliffs for bird eggs when there's literally anywhere else? Only 36 people remained. They sent a letter to the British government basically saying, "Get us out of here." The government did. The entire remaining population was evacuated. About 1,000 Soay sheep, to be exact, just walked away and left them there. Why? Probably because rounding up 1,000 semi-wild sheep on cliff-face terrain and loading them onto boats sounded like way too much work. Also, nobody really wanted them. These weren't your fluffy, docile farm sheep. Soays are basically the punk rockers of the sheep world. Aggressive, independent, terrible at following instructions. So the sheep became the last residents of St. Kilda. An entire population of ungulates left to fend for themselves on an island with no predators, no shepherds, and barely any resources. This is where things should have gone very, very wrong. Here's what everyone expected to happen. The sheep would overgraze what little vegetation existed. They'd strip the island bare. Then they'd starve. Population crash. Maybe a few would survive. But the island would become a wasteland. Classic Malthusian catastrophe. It's the same story that's played out on islands around the world when you introduce grazing animals without natural checks. But St. Kilda had a surprise up its sleeve. Because this island, it's not completely barren. It's just incredibly stingy about what it offers. Technically. But it's not the lush green stuff you see in pastoral paintings. It's tough, wind-blasted vegetation that grows in patches between the rocks. There are also steep cliff sides with ledges that collect thin layers of soil where hardy plants somehow manage to survive. The sheep dispersed across the island. And here's where the first weird thing happened. They didn't just survive, they thrived, at least at first. By the 1950s, without any humans culling them for food or managing the population, the sheep numbers had exploded. Estimates put the population at around 1,400 to 1,800 sheep, on an island that probably has a carrying capacity of, well, nobody really knew. Scientists started paying attention. Here was this perfect natural laboratory. An isolated population with no predators, no human intervention, and limited resources. A closed system you could actually study. In 1985, researchers from the University of Cambridge set up a long-term study. They started tagging sheep, tracking births, monitoring deaths, collecting data on everything from horn size to coat color to how fat individual sheep were getting. And that's when things got really interesting, because the sheep population wasn't stable. It was going through these massive boom and bust cycles. Some years, lambs everywhere, sheep looking plump and healthy. The next year, mass die-offs. Bodies littering the landscape. The population would crash by 30%, sometimes even 60% in a single winter. At first, it looked random. Bad weather one year, boom, lots of dead sheep. And patterns emerged. This wasn't random at all. This was a population regulating itself in real time through one of the most brutal mechanisms nature has to offer. Here's how it worked. In good years, when there was plenty of vegetation and the weather was mild, the sheep would breed successfully. Lots of lambs born. Most of them survived. The population would swell. But here's the catch. St. Kilda has a finite amount of food. As the population grew, each sheep got less to eat. They'd enter the winter in worse condition. Thinner, less body fat, weaker immune systems. Then winter would hit. And St. Kilda winters are not gentle. Wind speeds that regularly exceed 100 miles per hour. Temperatures that plunge. And the vegetation basically shuts down. There's nothing to eat. So the weakest sheep would start dying. But not just the weak ones. The males with the biggest horns would die at higher rates too. Wait, what? The biggest, most impressive males were more likely to die? That seems backwards. Big horns mean you won the genetic lottery, right? You're strong, you're successful, you should survive. Nope. Curled horns are expensive. Not in money, obviously, but in calories. Growing and maintaining huge horns requires energy. A lot of it. In years of plenty, no problem. But in a harsh winter when food is scarce, those impressive horns become a liability. The males with the biggest horns were starving themselves trying to maintain them. They'd die while smaller horned males scraped by. The researchers were watching evolution happen and fast forward. Natural selection was playing out on a timescale of years instead of millennia. And it wasn't selecting for the biggest or the strongest. It was selecting for efficiency, for sheep that could do more with less. The females were evolving too. The island sheep were getting smaller, generation by generation, incrementally, but measurably smaller. Why? Because in an environment where food is the limiting factor, being smaller is an advantage. Smaller bodies need less food. Smaller mothers can survive harsh winters more easily. They can nurse their lambs longer on less energy. This is the opposite of what usually happens with domestic animals. Humans breed sheep to be bigger, fatter, more productive. More wool. But nature, when left to its own devices on St. Kilda, was hitting the reverse button. The sheep were shrinking. But here's where it gets even weirder. The sheep weren't just getting smaller. They were changing genetically in ways that scientists didn't expect. The researchers could track coat color genetics. Soy sheep come in two main colors: dark brown and a lighter tan color. The dark color is dominant genetically, so you'd expect dark sheep to eventually take over the population. Right. Wrong. The light-colored sheep were holding steady at about 25% of the population. Why? The researchers dug into the data and found something wild. The light-colored sheep were surviving harsh winters better. Not by a lot, but by enough. Maybe 5% better survival rate, which over time adds up. Why would coat color affect survival in winter? Nobody's entirely sure. One theory is that the lighter coat might be linked genetically to other traits that help with winter survival. Maybe better fat storage. Maybe more efficient digestion. Maybe just dumb luck in how the genes are arranged. But whatever the reason, the light sheep were defying the usual genetic dominance patterns. The scientists were also finding that female sheep were giving birth at younger ages than expected. In most sheep populations, ewes don't breed until they're at least 2 years old. On St. Kilda, some were breeding successfully at 1 year old. Evolution was pushing them to reproduce faster, earlier, before the island had a chance to kill them. And then there were the die-offs themselves. These weren't just random cullings of the weak. They were information. Every winter that killed a large portion of the population was teaching the survivors something. It was selecting for sheep that could read the environment better, store fat more efficiently, forage more effectively. Then it would recover. Then it would crash again. But with each cycle, the average sheep was getting slightly better adapted to St. Kilda's harsh reality. The island was sculpting them, generation by generation, into something uniquely suited to survive there. By the 2000s, the researchers had decades of data. They could predict with reasonable accuracy when die-offs would occur based on population density and weather patterns. They could track genetic changes across generations. They were watching a complete ecosystem regulating itself without any human input. But nature had one more surprise. Climate change started affecting St. Kilda. Winters were getting milder, not warm, but less brutally cold. And the die-offs started getting less severe. The population crashes weren't as dramatic. The sheep numbers were staying higher more consistently. You might think that's good news for the sheep. More sheep surviving sounds positive, right? But here's the twist. The researchers noticed something worrying. The sheep were starting to show signs of worse overall health. Parasites were becoming more common. Disease was spreading more easily. Why? Because the population was staying at carrying capacity more consistently. Those harsh winters and die-offs weren't just random tragedies. They were pressure release valves. They kept the population below the point where disease and parasites could really take hold. They created breathing room for the survivors. Without those periodic purges, the sheep were living at the edge of what the island could support all the time. They were surviving, but barely. This is where the story gets philosophically weird. Are those die-offs cruel, or are they necessary? Is it better for 60% of the sheep to die quickly in winter, allowing the survivors to thrive, or is it better for 100% to survive but live in constant marginal conditions? Nature apparently prefers the first option. The boom and bust cycle, as brutal as it sounds, created a healthier population overall. The survivors were stronger, more resilient, better adapted. The periods of low population density gave the vegetation time to recover. It was a cycle, not a disaster. The St. Kilda sheep have now been unsupervised for over 90 years. That's roughly 30 sheep generations. And in that time, they've evolved measurably. They're smaller, they're more efficient. Their genetics have shifted in ways that favor survival on this specific island. They've become uniquely adapted to a place that should probably kill them. This is evolution in a bottle. A perfect case study of how populations adapt when you remove human interference and let natural selection do its thing. The sheep aren't thriving in any comfortable sense. They're locked in a constant struggle with their environment. But they're surviving, reproducing, and slowly becoming something slightly different from their ancestors. The researchers still monitor them. The study is ongoing. New insights into how evolution works at small scales over short time periods. The sheep don't know they're famous in scientific circles. They don't know their DNA is being analyzed in laboratories, or that their population dynamics are being used to model everything from conservation strategies to climate change impacts. They're just sheep, doing what sheep do, eating grass when they can find it, breeding when conditions allow, dying when winter gets too harsh, living on this remote rock in the Atlantic, completely unaware that they've become one of the most important evolutionary studies in modern biology. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's that nature is way more resilient and way more creative than we give it credit for. Those sheep were supposed to fail. They were dumped on an island that couldn't support them and abandoned. But instead of dying out, they adapted. They found a way, not through some miraculous intervention, but through the brutal, elegant simplicity of natural selection. Or maybe the lesson is that our definitions of success and failure don't really apply to nature. We look at those winter die-offs and see tragedy. Nature sees a population regulating itself. We see an inhospitable island. The sheep see home. The St. Kilda sheep aren't just survivors. They're pioneers. Adaptation in real time. And the incredible persistence of life in the face of impossible odds. All because some humans walked away and left them to figure it out. And figure it out they did. On an island with zero grass. Well, almost zero grass. But you get the point.